Hello, I am Wayne Ellison, President of the 100 Black Men of North Metro Atlanta. Allow me to introduce you to the 100 Black Men of America. The 100 Black Men of America is a national mentoring organization with over 110 chapters around the world, serving nearly 10,000 mentees on an annual basis. The 100 Black Men of North Metro Atlanta. Our chapter covers Gwinnett, Cobb, and Fulton counties. We have been in existence for over 31 years, and we currently have 84 active members in our chapter. We have four pillars in which we focus on: mentoring, economic empowerment, health and wellness, and education. Tonight's conversation, suicide education, is a part of our health and wellness series, our virtual conversations. At this time, I would like to introduce our Vice President, Keith Dennis, to share a few words, and then he will introduce our speaker. Keith?
So much, Wayne, and thank you everyone for joining us for this important dialogue on this evening. As Wayne stated, I am the Vice President of the 100 Black Men of North Metro Atlanta, and it is indeed my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the hour. Sherrard Crespo is a licensed clinical social worker who obtained her master's degree in social work from Louisiana State University in 2017. Ms. Crespo specializes in suicide education, prevention, crisis intervention, postvention, grief, and trauma management. She is currently employed with ViaLink as the Director of Outreach and Prevent Child Abuse Louisiana, the Louisiana state affiliate for Prevent Child Abuse America, which is operated by ViaLink. She provides clinical oversight of ViaLink's 24/7 contact center, community outreach, and, of course, education. She also facilitates ViaLink's two support groups, Survivors of Suicide Loss and Real Talk, a support group for teens with suicide ideation. Before Ms. Crespo comes, I'd like to share a personal story with you. You see, 2 years ago, I lost my brother to suicide. The day before he took a gun and shot himself, I was talking with him about the NCAA playoffs, basketball playoffs that were starting. We were talking about our teams that we were going to pick and our brackets and all those things. And he was also sharing with me how he was looking forward to coming to my daughter's graduation in a couple of weeks. And we talked for about an hour and a half. And I didn't pick up on anything being wrong at all. And this is my big brother, and we had a very good relationship, and we were very close. And I didn't pick up on anything, nor did his kids that lived in Houston with him. But the next day, he took his own life. Um, After the fact, going through a lot of his papers and things, what we realized is that he had been suicidal for about 10 years, and we never knew it. Now, there were always things that would happen that were a little bit out of character for him, but nothing that would give us the indication that he was hurting or that he needed help of this type. So you can imagine it was quite a shock for us. So I'm just hoping tonight that there is something that is said or we get some tips where, if we're faced with a situation where we're not sure if someone is suicidal, we'll know exactly what to do. So really looking forward to Ms. Crespo's presentation. And so without further ado, we'd like to bring her on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing your story. It's not an easy thing to talk about, grief in general. But I think it so brings home the point of that we often talk about suicide or think about suicide like it happens to other people. It doesn't happen to the people we know. And that's not the case. And that's really what, if I get one message across today, I hope it's that I'm taking this subject that we often try to keep in the shadows and bringing it into the light and increasing our comfortability with this subject of suicide, because decreasing the stigmatization, increasing people
Yeah.
feeling comfortable coming forward to ask for help, that's the only way that we can reduce suicide rates. Um, I began my journey with working with suicide with working with survivors of suicide loss in a grief support group when I was just an intern in grad school. And I was so struck by this grief. It's a complicated, traumatic grief when you lose someone to suicide. And I just vividly remember sitting in that group and trying to embrace my group members with just pain share, as I call it, and thinking nobody should have to go through this. Nobody should have to go through this. We have to do more about this problem. And that is really what started me on my journey of research and working with people who are at risk for suicide. So with that, I will bring us into our presentation. I do welcome any and all questions if you want to throw them in the chat as we're going. Um, I do talk really fast. I'll throw that out there right now. I'm well aware of it. But I do like to try and get a lot of information in a pretty short amount of time, because I want you to walk away feeling like you've learned something. And again, taking away a little bit of the stigma and the fear surrounding this subject. That's in fact what I kind of want to start with, why I call this presentation Suicide Education and Response rather than Suicide Prevention, because I think that term suicide prevention can be misconstrued a little bit. What I mean by that, and I learned this when I was talking about this presentation probably about 5 years ago with a group of wonderful interns at a nonprofit here in Louisiana. And they were talking about why they don't like that term, suicide prevention. And what we nailed it down to was that because when we're talking about the real way to prevent suicide death, which is, of course, what we want to prevent, we actually have to embrace that people have thoughts of suicide. We don't necessarily cure thoughts of suicide. We help people to learn how to live with the way that their brain works. We don't know the root cause of why some people have thoughts of suicide and others do not. And there is no cure for it, just like there's no cure for anything when it comes to mental health. Someone who has, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder, not anxiety caused by a circumstance, we don't cure that. Someone learns how to thrive in their life with the way that their brain works. And it is the same when it comes to thoughts of suicide. They're not caused by the external stuff. They might make the thoughts bigger, the external stress, but the thoughts are there because that's the way that someone's brain works. And the only way to help someone to thrive with the way their brain works and keep themselves safe and feel like they are thriving, not just surviving, is to let them talk about it, to learn and to get the gunk out and find out what type of supports work best for them. So I want to start off with a few statistics about suicide. I know statistics can be boring, but I think that it really brings home, why are we talking about this? Why is this a buzz topic? Why are we having presentations about this? And I always start with this statistic of the globe, that worldwide, approximately one person dies by suicide every 40 seconds. And I know you might see there that statistic is from 2015 from the World Health Organization. It stayed about the same, not a dip worldwide. And not only do I start with this statistic because it's a big, scary number, but of what it also represents, that this is the globe. That means that suicide is affecting every country, every religion, every race, every culture, every socioeconomic status. Suicide is basically the only thing on our earth that does not discriminate. And I think that's something that's very important to keep in mind as we move forward. Bringing things a little bit closer to home, here in the US, there is one death by suicide every 11.7 minutes. Sometimes that's 11.2 minutes, depends on the day of the week, the month of the year, but you're looking at approximately 5 deaths by suicide every hour just in the US alone. So, just in this hour of my presentation, that's 5 deaths to really kind of bring that home what that means. Even bigger than that, there is one attempt every 32 seconds. So this number of attempts is actually much larger than the death rate. Nationally speaking, suicide is the 11th leading cause of death, which has consistently ranked much higher than homicide, which is the 16th leading cause of death. We did see a slight dip in suicide deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic, where it dropped to being the 12th leading cause of death. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, it was the 10th leading cause of death. But this statistically and historically speaking has followed the pattern that we've always seen with suicide. That in the midst of the chaos of a national crisis, we do see a slight dip in the amount of deaths. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the easiest example would be 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, you remember we were all in the streets lighting candles, singing songs, flying our flags. Then 1, 2, 3 years post that, there's still the trauma to our country, to the people that lost people, et cetera. And those suicide rates went back up. The same with the COVID-19 pandemic, as separated even as we were as people because we had to be. If we think of the relief efforts that were started, the technology that was developed, Zoom, all of this tech, how we're all here right now. We didn't do Zooms like this prior to the pandemic. There was a lot of community, there was a lot of relief. But then, about 1, 2, 3 years post the crisis, the trauma from that crisis is still there, but the relief is gone and the community is gone. And we see suicide rates start to peak back up. So they are falling in line with how we would have predicted historically as it comes to suicide death rates. For our young people, suicide is the second leading cause of death. Only accidents kill more adolescents than suicide does. And they are the only age group that we did not see a dip in the death rate of suicide with the pandemic. Elderly adults, the 65 plus demographic, a very much underserved population when it comes to mental health, actually have death rates for suicide 50% higher than the nation as a whole. A lot of theories as to why. It's not necessarily that their ideation is higher, but that their death rate is higher. And then broken down by gender, 4 times more men than women complete suicide. That means die from their suicide attempt. However, women attempt suicide 3 times more often than men. Um, Historically and statistically speaking, this is because men were much more likely to use guns or firearms as a suicide method, which have about a 98% mortality rate. And women were much more likely to use intentional self poisoning, which would be purposefully ingesting an overdose of a substance or purposefully ingesting a poisonous substance. And that only has about a 3 to 5% mortality rate because your body has a lot of ways to naturally save yourself. And it's also not an instantaneous death. Someone may find you or you may be able to reach out for help. I mention this mostly to say that probably a lot of you have heard in the news or read articles about it that the suicide rate in women and in younger people and in people of color are going up. Um, and it's not so much that the ideation, the thoughts of suicide are going up, it's that the death rate is going up. And we're really at a moment of crisis with this, in particular with our young people, because you can now just at the touch of your fingertips, if you grab your phone, you can Google the most effective methods for suicide. So now people are dying much more frequently from their suicide attempts because they are attempting in ways that are lethal. Whereas before, when you kind of had to trust your gut on what was going to work, and it's very hard to attempt suicide, it was more like the seventh or eighth suicide attempt before someone got near lethality. And now it can be the second or third time. There's not as much time for intervention because, again, more and more suicide attempts are becoming lethal than they were before. Oftentimes, when we're speaking of suicide and what is the big picture, we like to use this image of the iceberg. And it's because the death rate for suicide, which from the latest CDC numbers was 48,183 annually, that's huge. That's way too big. Anything above zero is too much, but that's a big, scary number. But in the big picture of suicide, just like the tip of the iceberg, it looks big and scary, but there's a way bigger picture beneath the surface of the topics of suicide that we talk about less or that are less known. If we were to dig one layer beneath in this iceberg, we would first talk about unreported suicide deaths, which is anywhere from 1,600 to 8,000 a year. And I know that's a wide breadth of a number, but it's unreported data. So we've got to guesstimate. There's lots of reasons why a death by suicide might go unreported in suicide census data. Suicide census data is gathered by what is on the coroner's report was the cause of death, suicide. So the coroner will often have to default to an accident if there's not actual evidence, like a note or someone speaking out loud to someone that they were intentionally taking their own life. And it's a bit of a myth that most people who die by suicide leave a note behind. The majority of people who do die by suicide do not leave a note behind. And most of the time, not all the time, but those that do leave a note behind, the note is pretty unemotional. It's kind of like, I love you, I'm sorry, here's my banking information, etc. They even did a study where they were comparing the notes of people who did thankfully survive their suicide attempt versus those who had died from their suicide attempt. And the ones who did survive, the notes were quite different. They were a lot longer, they were a lot more emotional. And it's believed by suicide theorists that that is reflecting that there's still this attachment to life. And it's why someone was not able to actually lethally attempt. So many attempts are thwarted or non-lethal right at the very last second because that person is still somewhat aligned with life. There's an ambivalence, which we're going to talk about, and it's reflected in the notes. Again, nothing is universal, but that is more often than not what we're looking at. So that big scary number of 48,000 has an additional 1,600 to 8,000 to that. If we were to dig even deeper beneath the surface of this suicide iceberg, we would talk about non-fatal suicide behaviors, which would be when somebody does attempt suicide and thankfully survives. I would like to point out that the only thing that indicates if harm against the self was a suicide attempt is what was the intent. It does not matter how lethal or non-lethal it was. If someone's intent was to take their own life, even it was taking 3 baby aspirin, that is a suicide attempt. You cannot judge suicide by what the attempt looked like. Most attempts start out pretty non-lethal because it is very, very hard to attempt suicide. Our brain, as complex as it is, has one mission. Our brain, it connects knowledge to things that it already knows. And the one thing we're born with in our brain is, how do I keep my body alive? What that means is that every single piece of knowledge, memory, trivia, etc., that you know is connected to, how do I keep this body alive? Your brain has one prime directive, which is to keep your body alive. So to overcome that most basic instinct that we have is a very long and difficult journey, but we don't always see it. But non-fatal suicide behaviors, if we're looking at attempt rates, for elderly adults, there's about 4 attempts for every 1 death by suicide. Believed that suicide attempts in elderly adults are more fatal because their bodies are more broken down, so it's easier to succumb to action taken against the body. And because part of the process of being capable of a suicide attempt is losing your fear of death and losing your fear of the pain of the actual attempt. And adaptively speaking, as we get into our much later years, we lose a bit of a fear of death and we're not as afraid of pain because our bodies have been through more pain. So it makes it, I guess, quote unquote, easier, for lack of a better term, to attempt suicide lethally. Adults, so the general adult age range, there's about 25 attempts for every 1 death by suicide. And for adolescents, there are 100 to 200 attempts for every 1 death by suicide. And remember, that's their second leading cause of death. So when we're looking at this iceberg, the big scary iceberg where we thought the picture was just the 48,000, you add another 1,600 to 8,000 to that. You multiply that by 4. You multiply it by 25. Then you multiply it by 200. This iceberg is so much bigger than we're even conceptualizing at. But the biggest part of the iceberg, the most in the shadows, the most beneath the surface, what we talk about the least, are people who have thoughts of suicide, walking around, some in this meeting, coping and struggling to different degrees with thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore. And that number is immeasurable. It's impossible for us to get completely accurate census data for that. But most suicide theorists believe that in westernized cultures such as the US, it's about 9 out of 10 people who will have some degree of a thought of suicide at some point in their life. So 9 out of 10 people. I mentioned that to remind you, don't think that you have to be able to spot suicide. You can't put that type of pressure on yourself. And you're much better off with kind of just understanding that whomever you know most likely will have, has had, or is currently having some degree of a thought of not being alive anymore. So when we look at this iceberg, what is the big picture? It's all of us. We're all in there in some way, shape, or form. Whether we've had thoughts of suicide ourselves, we know someone who has attempted suicide, we've supported someone who has had thoughts of suicide, or we've lost a loved one, or even someone we admire to suicide. Everybody is in this iceberg, but that is not the way we talk about suicide. The big picture is that people are dying, and we don't talk about that enough. But even more people are living with suicide ideation, and we are talking about that even less because we are afraid. And talking is what will save lives. Every time I'm asked by somebody what will reduce the suicide rate, it's that we have to end the stigmatization surrounding suicide. I will get into this with more detail, but the stigmatization about this mental health topic is causing those who have thoughts of suicide to feel completely alone. And that feeling of isolation is literally what's killing people. But by talking about suicide and by knowing the facts, we can destigmatize this topic and we can normalize it. And I get some pushback when I use that term normalize, but I don't mean normalize to encourage suicide attempts. I mean normalize that people have thoughts of suicide. Look at these numbers we just went through. It is normal. We can reduce that fear, and that means that we will gain hope in letting others know that they are not alone because the stigma is what is killing people. The stigma surrounding suicide, it creates this degree of discomfort. I'm sure a lot of you are uncomfortable right now, and that's totally fine. Nothing wrong with being uncomfortable. I'm sure there are a lot of people who registered to be here tonight and then kind of opted out of it because it was like, well, that's not actually how I want to spend my evening. Totally understandable. But this discomfort can become an obstacle to those who need help. But more importantly, it hinders those who are the help givers. I even say, I went to a wonderful graduate school program for my social work degree. I think I spent half a day of the full 2 years talking about suicide. I had to educate myself when I decided that this is what I want to specialize in. And that doesn't make any sense to me. Why would someone be given a clinical license and not know enough about suicide? But that is the truth of it. And it's because of the stigmatization. We even want to be careful of our language and not use the term commit suicide if we can help it. That term committing suicide is rooted in a lot of historical stigmatization about the misunderstanding of a suicide attempt. One with suicide being illegal, which don't ask me how that works, but it's illegal on some state law books. And then also thinking back more in history of, the Catholic Church being a ruling body at the time. And it was deemed a sin, committing a sin, committing suicide. And that term commit, when we think about it, is like an intentional act to inflict something upon others. And that is not what suicide is. Suicide is not even an intentional act to hurt the person that might die. It is, as backwards as it might seem, our survival instinct kicking in, our fight or flight response to get out of what feels like unsurvivable physical pain. So we want to be sure suicide, as I call it, is a brain disease. And if someone dies from that disease, they died by suicide. It would, we would never say someone committed cancer if they passed away from cancer. And it is just the same thing that some people can fight and fight and fight against this brain disease and they don't find the right help and they do pass away from it. And if someone attempts suicide, they attempted suicide. So we just want to be very mindful of our language because our words do matter. In breaking down the stigmatization of suicide, fear and shame are the foundation surrounding suicide. People with thoughts of suicide fear being labeled crazy, thought of as bad, and we've all heard the things. We've maybe even said it before, where you say, well, I got divorced and I didn't kill myself over it. How selfish was it to leave your family behind? That's the coward's way out. They took the easy way out. And taking your own life is not easy. It is the hardest thing that someone can do, and the amount of pain that someone is in when you get to that point, it's not something most of us can imagine. We want to, again, just be so careful of our own thoughts behind this because, again, it wasn't the divorce, it wasn't the whatever that caused someone to attempt suicide. As confusing and too simple as it can sound, what causes suicide attempts is suicide ideation. And that's the way that somebody's brain works when they can't get the proper support. Survivors of suicide, those that have lost loved ones to suicide, can really feel the shame that our society holds for those who have died by their own hand. In my work with suicide loss survivors, I mean, I've just heard the most awful stories before. Typically when someone dies by other means, people are surrounded by friends and family, fellowship. You get casseroles and dinner brought to you. People are laughing and telling stories. But so often, those that have lost their loved ones to suicide go through their grief alone. They don't get to say their loved one's name. People don't want to talk about them. And then just horrible things get said. I mean, true story, someone that used to volunteer with me in my loss support group at the funeral for their daughter who had died by suicide. Someone said, "Oh, I'm really sorry that your daughter is going to hell now." I mean, that would never be said in any other kind of loss. And it's all us stigmatizing suicide and this mental health topic. So I say all this to say that we all have our own past experiences. We all have our own biases. That is the way we make sense of the world, and it's totally fine. But when we are in a help giving position, it is really important that we have the bravery to be introspective enough to know what might be a hindrance to us when it's our time to help someone so that we can leave it at the door, so that we're always ready with our arms wide open to help someone who's coming to us in pain. And I want to talk a minute about stigma, just the concept of stigma, because it sounds like a mean, ugly word. But stigmatization is a fear response. We didn't stigmatize suicide because we were hateful. Suicide was stigmatized because we were afraid of it. When we live in fear of something, our brain doesn't like that. It causes a lot of agitation that it cannot put up with. So your brain will find a reason so that it doesn't have to think about it. So it doesn't have to live in that fear. So that began with us kind of othering suicide, like, oh, it only happens to these types of people, so that we didn't have to think that we had to worry about it. Nobody wants to live in fear, thinking that somebody that they love could be having thoughts of suicide, or that at some point in their life they might have thoughts of suicide. But by othering suicide to the degree that we have, we've gone too far. And now people think that they cannot reach out for help because it's bad. And it's not bad. It is the way that people's brains work. You can't just tell someone, don't think that way. That would be like if I told someone with asthma to breathe better. This is the way that somebody's brain works, and there is help. There's tons of help. People thrive when they get the right help when they have thoughts of suicide because they learn the way their brain works. Just like people can learn the way their brain works if they have depression, if they have anxiety, just like someone with diabetes can learn the way their body works, that someone with asthma can learn the way their lungs work. There is so much help. And nobody will believe in that when we have so much stigma because they can't reach out. This stigmatization carried over creates a lot of internalized stigma. So, what I mean by that is that now so many people have these messages of, well, suicide only happens to these like weak, cowardly people. So, then oftentimes when someone has their first thought of suicide, when it's small, when it's, I don't want to do this anymore, I don't want to wake up tomorrow, I wouldn't care if I died in my sleep. Instead of reaching out for help for that, people usually go one of two ways. One, saying, nope, I'm not that type of person that has thoughts of suicide. And so they bury it. You cannot get rid of thoughts of suicide that way. And they will come out, and they will come out explosively. And we do not want that. Other times, what will happen is someone will say, whoop, I don't want to talk about this. I can't tell my friends or my family about this because I don't want to bum them out. That starts the cycle of suicide ideation having power over the brain. Because what we've started with this feeling like you're alone in this, like you're othered, like you're weird, that's what we call a thwarted sense of belongingness. It's a sense of isolation. And that thought of, I don't want to tell people about this because I don't want them to worry about me. That's the start of what we call perceived burdensomeness, feeling like you are a burden on others. So that thought of suicide has started really small. And ideally, we want to be in a world where when that first thought comes and it's really small, someone can come and talk about it. Because when it's really small, it is a lot easier to learn how to gain mastery over the way that your brain works. That doesn't mean that your brain won't send you those messages sometimes, but you'll know what to do with them. So if you think of suicide ideation like a little tumor in the brain, it's not a tumor, but it's easier to visualize it that way. So it started small, but it started on these two paths of thwarted sense of belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. So what's going to happen is you're not going to tell anybody about this. For a lot of people, when you're not going to tell anybody about this, that tumor is going to grow. Those thoughts of suicide are going to grow bigger. So what happens when they're growing bigger is that they're going to have more control over your brain. So that thought of, well, I don't want to bum people out, I don't want them to be worried about me, is going to grow into thoughts of saying, I really don't give anything in this world. I'm not good. I don't give anything to other people. I can't take anything from other people because I don't give them anything, and they would be better off without me. That suicide ideation is twisting your logic into not seeing the world as it really is. That's why it's called perceived burdensomeness. You're not an actual burden, and everybody cares that you're alive, but you can't see it because the way of that ideation has twisted the way you see the world. And if we think about it, that tumor has grown bigger, That's a bigger part of yourself that you're isolating. You can't always see it from the outside. Most people do not. I mean, I say in my work with loss survivors, it's a very polared experience where either it was a long journey with someone that they knew was struggling with thoughts of suicide. They tried to help, tried to get the right therapies, and they just never found something that worked all the way. Or, and what happens more often is that nobody had any idea. It was not shown on the outside. Nobody had any idea that this is something that someone was struggling with because they didn't know how to talk about it. And so you're isolating this bigger part of yourself, even if you can't see it externally. So, what I mean by this isolation, this thwarted sense of belongingness, is that when they have done brain mapping now, as we can with our technology, they've been able to show that this type of isolation, this feeling of a thwarted sense of belongingness that the suicide ideation tumor is causing, it activates the part of our brain that feels physical pain. So, I mean it quite literally, not metaphorically, when I'm saying that someone feels like they're in unsurvivable physical pain. A client put it to me this way once, where they said, if you remember the news footage of 9/11, and there were people that were stuck at the top of the towers, and they were jumping out the windows, they were taking their own life, not in the way that we generally think of suicide, but they were taking their own life. And my client was like, but we all understood that. They were on fire. They were dying. They were suffering. They were dying of smoke inhalation and they were on fire. And he said, it's the same thing for me, but you just can't see my flames. That physical pain feeling from that isolation is very real. So when we get to this crisis point of a suicide attempt, how I said our fight or flight response is activated, it's activated because of that physical pain feeling. That means you get cognitive constriction, you get tunnel vision. When our fight or flight response is activated, it shuts off the part of our brain that's more forward thinking, the part of our brain that has impulse control, that understands our mortality, that understands cause and effect, that understands the long term consequences of things. It is not getting electricity because that isolation, that pain has put us in fight or flight mode. And then that is now being paired with my brain twisting my logic into thinking that everybody is going to be better off without me. So I'm in fight or flight mode in what feels like unsurvivable physical pain. And I think everybody's going to be better off without me. That's really hard to survive. That's really hard to combat. As long as someone is still breathing, there is hope for them. But wouldn't it be so much easier if we were able to get someone connected to help and to hope and to support when that thought was small, before that tumor had that much control and before it started causing that pain response? And that's the goal of reducing the stigma, is so that people can come forward before that crisis point happens. And that's how we're really, truly going to save lives on a big, impactful level. By letting someone really talk about their pain, that's how we reduce risk. I want to speak for a minute about Thomas Joiner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. This is the most universally agreed upon theory of suicide that we have. And for anybody who would like to, on their own, learn more about suicide, I highly, highly recommend Thomas Joiner. He's still alive, he's a professor. He is a very celebrated suicidologist, and he wrote his first book called Why People Die by Suicide, which was the breakdown of this interpersonal psychological theory. And it was, I mean, wonderful. And it's really easy to read, which is also why I recommend it, because he writes not only from an academic place, but Thomas Joiner is a loss survivor. His father died by suicide. So he writes from a real place of compassion for a place where everybody can understand what he's talking about. And I really appreciate him for that. But what is so important to me in this interpersonal psychological theory of suicide is that he points out the difference between suicide desire, that thought of not wanting to be alive anymore, versus capability for a suicide attempt. There's a real big importance in understanding the difference between the two. Because again, so often when we say the word suicide, people are thinking of attempts, but that's a much smaller piece of the iceberg than people who are having thoughts of suicide. And we don't live every day with the capability to attempt suicide, even if we are living with thoughts of suicide. So, suicide ideation is like the brain disease. It is long term, chronic, lifelong for most people. That doesn't mean that every single day they're having thoughts of suicide. What it means is that that is in their brain, so that when the right internal, external stressors come up, that thought might flare. That can be external stressors as we normally think of them, conflict, illness, whatever, and even internal stressors. I'm under constant stress. I've got that constant cortisol release that could exacerbate it. So, all different mechanisms as to how this might, stay small for some people naturally or get bigger and whatnot for other people. But it is something that is always in someone's brain. It can, again, be kind of attached to a life stressor and then it flares up in that moment. And then thankfully, that person never has that type of stressor again. So it doesn't. But if they had happened to, it would have. So just to think about that, like that's what we don't cure. That's what we get long term therapy, long term support systems, whatever's going to work for someone to learn how to thrive with the way that their brain works versus suicide attempts, which only happen when we are in fight or flight mode. That's how we have that extra like oomph to be able to attempt, which is so hard. It's because of that cognitive constriction and because of the agitation that occurs in the brain during fight or flight, that extra surge of cortisol. It's believed to give someone the energy to actually attempt. Now, we can only operate in fight or flight mode for about a day without de-escalation externally. Your brain will not it will take itself out of fight or flight mode after about a day. So suicide attempt windows are short. They're like the short-term fever for this longer-term illness, if we want to call it that. So when we're talking about safety risk, which for most people, that's going to be few and far between in your conversations when it comes to suicide, you're only looking at can someone keep themselves safe for a day? It's very short term. When we're talking about safety, we're never doing these long term kind of, I'm never going to attempt suicide ever in my life thing again. It's very concentrated to this day. Can you keep yourself safe? Let's come up with a plan. And people can learn to keep themselves safe when they have the right types of support. I worked with a 16-year-old who was able to identify in themselves, okay, I can tell that I'm kind of getting into this agitated mode. I know myself. I might be going into an attempt window. So they knew their safety mechanisms to put in place, concentrated purely on safety for a couple of days, and then got back in their groove after that. Another client put it to me this way, where they said, I can feel the wave coming on. I know I need to ride the wave for the next couple days, and then I can get back into my normal routine. So people can learn how to keep themselves safe, but they've got to learn how their brain is working and when their brain is lying to them. So that's the importance again of someone just getting that right type of support. And it's so different for different people. You might just have a wonderful support system in your personal life that you can get that gunk out, learn how your brain works. For a lot of people, it might be therapy for some time. There's support groups, all kinds of things. It's different for everybody. But the biggest thing is that you can't have the pressure on thinking that you have to cure your thoughts of suicide. It's believed that that can be why so many people do die by suicide when they're in therapy because their thoughts abated, they got a little bit better, and they thought that they were supposed to be cured. So when those thoughts started coming back up, they either internally denied them or they were like, "Ooh, I can't say that they're coming back. I'm supposed to be cured." And then they got more explosive. But when we give someone that permission to know, like, yeah, they're probably going to come back at some point, that's okay. We'll handle it when that happens. Then they get to learn how their brain works and then they get to learn how to thrive with the way that their brain works. So attempt windows, they can definitely look different in the aftermath. There are certainly many suicide attempts where it has looked quite peaceful. But most people will enter into an intense state of agitation. You might not see that agitation from the outside, but their brain is agitated in that fight or flight mode. So that's kind of the difference between what we're thinking of coining as suicide crisis syndrome versus suicide ideation. So remember that suicide crisis state is the fight or flight mode activated to try and get someone out of what feels like unsurvivable physical pain. As backwards as it may seem, suicide attempts are a survival instinct. So I want to talk for a minute about warning signs versus risk factors. I so often am asked if I can give a presentation about warning signs for suicide. And I say no, because I, along with most suicide theorists, not that I'm a suicide theorist, but I just do a lot of research, do not believe in universal warning signs, other basically than someone saying, I'm having thoughts of suicide or I'm going to attempt suicide. You can trust that. But other than that, there are no known universal warning signs for suicide besides something obvious that you would be able to see. Someone researching how to attempt suicide, someone giving all their things away or writing a will. Like if you saw those things, you would know something was up. So don't put that type of pressure on yourself that you need to learn and identify all of these warning signs for suicide. Suicide cannot be put in a box. It looks so different on so many different people. Like, if we even think of celebrities who died by suicide, like Kurt Cobain versus Robin Williams, those were two very different lives and very even different looking deaths, but they both died from the same brain disease. So don't limit yourself in that way. In fact, it's been shown that warning signs, um, they actually kind of do the opposite because then we concentrate too much on these acute warning signs. And when our brain is so afraid of something, it's going to try and talk us out of it. So we'll be like, well, they don't quite fit this checkbox. So, phew, I don't have to worry. Or it limits how wide we cast our net. This was demonstrated to me so well, again, from a volunteer in my support group, wonderful, wonderful volunteers and members of support groups I have been so blessed to work with. But they volunteered for the suicide loss support group. They had lost their teenage son to suicide, and they were very involved with their church, which is a very wonderful thing. It really was a big support. And in a church news article, they were writing about that show, 13 Reasons Why, on Netflix. So it was way back when that happened. And for those of you unfamiliar, that was a horrible depiction of suicide. So do not watch it for factual based things of a young girl that had died by suicide. But they actually did a pretty good job showing the survivor loss on her parents' side, their kind of plot line on the show. But the church newsletter wrote an article about the show, and then in the middle of the article, they wrote, "Here's the 10 warning signs for suicide." And this volunteer for my group was so offended. So, one, we want to be careful because those warning signs can be quite stigmatizing and saying suicide only looks like this. But she was like, "This is not what my son looked like. Do you think if I had seen these obvious warning signs, I wouldn't have known something was wrong?" She's like, "My son was volunteering at summer camp. He was a Boy Scout. He was coming to dinner with us every night. We were laughing and joking. Like, this is not what he looked like." So we want to be really careful to not be limited by these warning signs because they stop us from reaching out for help. Or we have to say that, well, you have to look this bad before you're really deserving of help. So we want to be mindful of that when it comes to warning signs. Versus suicide risk factors, which would be things like being of a certain demographic or life experience, which means that if your brain has suicide ideation in it, this risk factor could either intensify your thoughts or make you more capable of a suicide attempt. Like, there's a risk factor for suicide and substance use. One can be because you might become more isolated as you do utilize substance misuse because, you're making decisions that your family's not okay with or you want to keep them away from it. So you're isolating yourself, which could intensify your thoughts of suicide. Also, substance use can come along with a lot of what Thomas Joyner calls painful and provocative experiences, basically meaning anything that separates you from your instinctual desire to preserve your own life. So, when you're utilizing something like opioids or heroin that you know could be laced with fentanyl, that's pushing you away from your survival instinct. Not because of suicide, but if you have suicide ideation in your brain, it's going to make you that much more capable of a suicide attempt. There is a little bit of a misconception surrounding alcohol use and suicide. It's very actually few and far between that people who die by suicide were intoxicated from alcohol, but chronic alcohol misuse can create these painful and provocative experiences, which might make you more capable of a suicide attempt. But suicide attempts are pretty intentional and they have to be pretty deliberate because it is so difficult to intentionally, lethally attempt suicide. So it's easier to just not be limited by any list. Anyone can potentially be at risk for suicide, which sounds scary, but if we really think about it, it's relieving. I don't have to memorize 78 signs and signals. I can just know that if I see someone who's struggling, I can just ask them about it. You cannot plant the idea of suicide in someone's head. That's called iatrogenic effect, where if you talk about a subject that you could cause harm, they've been studying the iatrogenic effect of talking about suicide since literally the 1890s. And it has been proven over and over and over again that there is none. You cannot plant the idea of suicide in someone's head. Because I hope I have explained pretty thoroughly how difficult of a journey it is to get to this point of attempting suicide. I even had someone ask me once, like when we're talking about, our really young folks, like our elementary school age children, and they said, well, they didn't know that word suicide before. And I said, well, they didn't know the word. That didn't mean they didn't have the thoughts or they didn't have the pain. Now we've given them a word so that they can reach out and label it and ask for help. And that's very important. They have been showing children as young as 6 can die by suicide, and children as young as 4 understand what death means in a different way than we do as adults, but they can conceptualize what it's like to not be alive anymore. So this is a subject that we need to be talking about and not just trying to kind of predict, because that just stigmatizes it more and more, when in fact, if we can just embrace, like, hey, we can talk about this and you're going to get help and you're going to thrive, that's a lot easier. So what can we do? It's that we have to be really comfortable talking, but more importantly, we have to become even more comfortable with listening. It is not easy to listen to someone talk about why they don't want to be alive anymore. It is solely what I do with my career, and it's never easy. But it's so important that we listen, because someone has to get that pain off their chest. If they don't get that gunk out, it's living in their brain, making them feel isolated. When instead, if someone listens, they make that connection, that isolation is cut and that pain is relieved. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to encourage their thoughts, like being like, yep, totally understandable. You shouldn't want to be alive anymore. But we can acknowledge that they feel that way and validate the underlying pain. What are those emotions going on with it? I can hear you're feeling alone, scared, angry, sad. I can connect to those emotions with someone and validate them. Because what we so often do with good intentions, because we're scared, is we say, oh, don't talk about that. Don't talk that way. You shouldn't talk that way. You have so much to live for. You have your mom, you have your dog, whatever it is. But when we say that, we're literally saying, don't talk about this. And someone needs to talk about it. So it's really important that we practice our responses so that we are ready and willing to listen. And if the only thing that you can learn from this is if someone comes to you and they're struggling, is for you to say, it scares me to hear this because I care so much about you, but I'm so glad you're talking to me about this. Tell me more. I'm here. I got all the time for you. Tell me what's going on. You can save a life. So sometimes we are going to need to ask someone directly if it is thoughts of suicide that they are struggling with. And it's important that we ask directly, because it is such a taboo topic and it's a very personal topic, and they might not be comfortable coming out and saying it themselves. So you might need to ask someone if you're concerned. And again, remember, it can do no harm. All that they can do is tell you no, and maybe it'll be awkward for a second. And don't put too much pressure on yourself about that. Maybe they'll lie to you. Maybe they will. But you've shown them that you're a safe space when they're ready to come talk about it. And I know that word safe space can sound kind of, I don't know, fluffy to some people. But anthropologically speaking, we are so tribal that making sure that our emotional needs are feeling safe with the people that we surround ourselves with are very linked to our instincts of survival, because of how we are as human beings. So it is actually very important that people are feeling like their emotions are validated to feel safe with you. You want to be sure, if you are asking, you say the word. Say the word killing yourself, say the word suicide, say the words not being alive anymore. You don't want to say the words hurting or harming yourself, because that can mean a lot of different things. Like, I've even heard someone say, yeah, I'm hurting myself every day by staying alive. And when we say that word hurting or harming ourselves, we're kind of subconsciously communicating that I'm uncomfortable with this subject of suicide. And we want to be able to show that we are comfortable talking about this. So I recommend practicing the question so that you can fake it till you make it if you have to. In particular, because when we're nervous as humans, we tend to phrase things in the negative. So our question would come more out like, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? And nobody's going to say yes to that. You're clearly uncomfortable. So I, again, very much encourage practicing so that even when you're nervous, it will roll off of your tongue naturally. I worked on suicide lines for a couple of years, and I always tell people, I'm like, if you were to listen to all of my calls, you would hear a lot of phrases that were repetitive, because I practiced them. The caller had no idea, and it was tailored to what they were going on, what was going on in their call, in their life. But you get nervous. And so we all had sayings that would come off of our tongue. Like, every time I give examples, you're going to hear me say, I just want to check in with you, because that's what I say. That's what rolls off of my tongue when I'm trying to figure out a segue into talking about suicide or what it might be. And that's totally okay. That's a good thing. It's coming off naturally. When you might be having to kind of bring up this subject out of nowhere, it's a lot easier if you kind of start the question with an observable behavior or a normalizing statement. So rather than just kind of out of nowhere say, "Hey, are you having thoughts of suicide?" You might say, "Look, I just want to check in with you because I've noticed that you've been having trouble getting to work or getting to class, whatever it might be. And it seems like you're really tired. And a lot of the times when people are feeling so sleep deprived or stressed, they might be having thoughts about suicide. I just want to check in with you. Is that something that you're struggling with?" Or even if you're just checking in with someone, not even specific to suicide, it is a lot easier if you start your question rather than like, "Hey, are you okay?" Because then we tend to think, "What? Do you think I'm wrong? Like, am I looking crazy? I don't know." If you put in observable behavior, like, "Hey, I just want to check in with you. You haven't, been coming around on Saturdays like you used to. Is everything all right?" That's a lot easier of a question to answer and for me to explain what's going on than just this kind of blanket, "Are you okay?" So, when possible, just starting with an observable behavior or again, a normalizing statement like, "I know you've been through a lot this year. You've had some loss in your family. And sometimes when people are experiencing such grief, they have thoughts of suicide. I just want to check in with you. Is that something that's been going on with you?" You've normalized it for them to be able to say yes. And peek behind the curtains in suicide response, you can make that statement if you need to anything to make it that it's okay. This is a normal experience if it's what you're going through. Makes it a lot easier to answer the question. You want to make sure, and then if someone is using euphemisms, like they're even saying, like, "I wouldn't care if I woke up. I want to go to sleep forever," whatever that might be, use them and clarify it with using the word suicide or not being alive anymore, or something like that. So saying, "I hear you saying that you're just so tired you wouldn't care if you woke up. When you're feeling that way, are you having thoughts about suicide? Are you having thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore?" Whatever's more comfortable for you. You want to be able to ask with a lot of confidence and as if you expect an answer, but also having the patience to sit through any uncomfortableness or silence. It's a heavy question, so someone might need a beat to kind of think of how they're going to respond. So, you, with open body language, being right there with them, giving them time to think is great. It's going to make them more comfortable. You are going to have to remember that you're then going to have a conversation where you have to be with them in their feelings. You're going to have to hear the hard stuff. You're going to have to connect to that pain with them. And you're going to have to validate what they've gone through. Because when we're having a conversation about suicide, what we're building to in that conversation is someone recognizing their own ambivalence. That part of them wants to die, but there is a part of them that does want to live. They're attached to life in some way. If they weren't, they would be dead. That's harsh, but it's the truth. But we can only create an ambivalent statement, as I'll show you how to do, and know both sides of the coin, the part of them that's attached to life and the part of them that wants to die, if we hear what those stressors are that have them feeling like they don't want to be alive anymore. And you want to remember that thoughts of suicide, again, do not mean that there is a safety risk. So you don't want to start out a conversation unless someone has indicated as such by asking if they're going to attempt suicide, because they could say no to that, but still be having thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore. So you want to start out more with the foundational layer of, are you having thoughts about suicide, thoughts about not being alive anymore? And then you can build into checking in on if there's an actual safety risk if they've been thinking about attempting. So a conversation has been shown to be much more effective than any sort of fancy risk assessment. If there are clinicians on the call, I understand that risk assessments are necessary. We need documentation, but our risk assessment should be just that. It should be the documentation. You should know it front and back so that you can document on it after you are done talking to your client. A client feeling assessed can elevate risk because of the way that the ideation has twisted the brain into feeling like they're not good enough for anybody on this world. So now they're feeling judged and criticized, and that can elevate that risk. And also, you got to think about things like when you know someone's asking you questions kind of on a checklist and they're expecting a certain type of answer, you don't give the whole truth. Like when we go to the doctor's office and the nurse comes in and they're asking those questions that we all hate, like, "How much have you been exercising? Do you ever eat fast food? Do you smoke? Do you ever drink?" And like, we all lie a little bit sometimes. And don't act like you don't. We've all done it. And it's because we're being expected to give an answer that's acceptable. I don't want to make the nurse upset with me or lecture me. So I'm going to tweak some of that a little bit. But it can be the same when we're talking about a more serious subject like suicide, because I'm now looking at someone who's expecting a certain type of answer from me, and there will be a response to it. But when we have a conversation where you're leaning into feelings, validating emotions, someone's gonna open up more. You're gonna get more valid information and then you can document it later. So it's just more important that you're understanding what you're listening for and you're gonna get most of that info. Or even if you do need to ask a direct question, you can attach it to something they said, which is a lot easier of a way to answer a question. I noticed you said that you're having trouble sleeping. When you've been having trouble sleeping, do those thoughts about how you would attempt go through your head? That's a lot easier than me out of nowhere saying, when do you think about when you might attempt suicide? If that was on your checklist. Me connecting it to something that someone has said is a conversation, and it makes it a lot easier to open up. So remember that conversations in real life are mostly statements. You don't want to get yourself stuck in a question answer game or asking a lot of why questions. Why questions limit conversation because when you ask a why question, I'm going to be thinking I have to justify what I'm going through. So let me figure out the right thing to say. Or they're going to get you into a more closed ended conversation where you're getting one or two word responses rather than getting kind of this full narrative of information that you want. And you're never going to get a concise answer as to why, quote unquote, someone wants to die by suicide because it's so complex in the brain and they themselves can't all the way understand it because it's the brain lying to us. So don't put a focus on why. Why is someone feeling that way right now? Instead, put the focus on what. What are you feeling right now? And that's going to get you a lot more information. And remember not to jump into assuming there's a safety risk. So when you're talking to someone about suicide, you're having this conversation, and this is outside of any clinical thing. This is if it comes up in work, in your personal life, whatever it is. You're talking to someone about suicide. You've opened the door. They're starting to get the gunk out. You have to listen patiently to those reasons for dying and not negate them. And remember, you don't have to validate the thoughts, but you can validate their emotions. I hear you saying that because you've been getting in these fights at home, that it has you thinking about not being alive anymore. And I hear that loneliness and that anger with you. Validate the emotions going on, believe it beneath it. And we're persistently listening for why they are alive, what we call buffers. Connections to life someone might not be able to feel because the pain of their suicide ideation is so big, but it's there. And we're building to this crescendo of the conversation, which will be the ambivalent statement, so that we can point that out to them, be their mirror to show they are still connected to life along with having thoughts of not wanting to be alive anymore. You've got to be able to acknowledge both. But the only way to acknowledge both is to hear the full story. And you'll always have at least that they're talking to you. You'll be able to put that into your ambivalent statement. But you want to be careful when you're acknowledging buffers because, of course, if someone brings up something, a loved one, a pet, a hobby, whatever, we want them to talk about that. But you have to be careful not to jump on it. You don't want to jump on it and say, what would it be like for your mom if you were to die by suicide? That's going to leave someone feeling criticized. And remember the way that the ideation has twisted the brain. They think their mom's going to be better off without them, and you cannot cure that twisted logic in a conversation. What you can do instead is say, "It sounds like your mom is really important to you." That's a small change, but it's very different because what you're doing, instead of trying to have them acknowledge how important they are to someone else, which they're not going to see, you are acknowledging how important something in life is to them, reflecting their attachments in life back to them. So just remember that rule of thumb, not how much they mean to other things or people, even though it's true, but reminding them of what they are attached to. I know your mom's really important to you. I know you love your dog. I know you're looking forward to graduating, whatever it might be. These are the things that we want to comment on and engage in if they come up, but you want to remember not to do it the other way around because it's going to be ineffective. You want to keep in mind that hospitalization is often not the best answer through the emergency department. You want to remember that the emergency room, so just pure emergency departments, if you live in an area that does have mental health emergency departments or mobile crisis, that's completely different. But if we're talking about just a pure hospital emergency department, it can often do more harm than good when we're sending someone there that doesn't need to be there. So remember that the hospital, the emergency room, is because someone needs physical assistance. So that would mean that someone's already attempted that day or they're going to attempt that day and you cannot stop them. And that doesn't mean wishy-washy, like, yeah, sometimes I think that I'm going to attempt with this, or if next week I don't get that job, I'm going to attempt. That is not imminent risk. They don't know if they'll be in fight or flight mode then. They don't know how they'll be feeling then. And the hospital's not going to keep them for 2 weeks. The hospital's going to keep them for maybe 3 days. So if someone was not going to attempt suicide that day, definitely, what are they in the hospital for those 3 days? It's not an intro into psychiatric care. It's not the hospital's fault. They just don't have the capacity for that. And there's often very limited follow up care. It's not the most effective entryway into the mental health system in your community. And it has been shown that failure to provide follow up care after a suicide attempt or even after ideation is associated with much higher rates of reattempt. I read an article very recently, or a study, I think it was in a book, about, I think it was with Marines, some branch of the military, and those that were seeking mental health treatment because of thoughts of suicide. And they had their control group and then they had the experimental group, and they were both receiving mental health care. So let me clarify that. But in the experiment group, they received these automated follow up texts after their appointments that were just like, hey, glad you came, type of thing. And even though these were automated follow up texts, the the group that received these follow-up texts had much, much lower rates of reattempt and much, much lower rates of intensity of suicide ideation. Follow-up is so, so important after a conversation or after help, and the hospitals don't have the capacity for it most of the time. Most patients report a pretty stigmatizing experience when it comes to going through the hospital, and that risk of a reattempt is very, very high. One study that I have quoted here found that those who had died by suicide often presented to the emergency department in the year before their death. And because it wasn't actually that type of cure that doesn't exist, they felt helpless and hopeless, but they didn't want to have to go through that experience again. So they stopped talking about what was going on with them and they thought they couldn't get better. So the hospital is definitely necessary at times. Someone's going to attempt that day, meaning I've got the method and I'm going to today and you cannot stop me. And I do mean today. Sure. We got to keep someone physically safe and the hospital might be the best option for that. But when that's not what we're working with, the hospital is usually not going to be your best answer. So, how we can know this is that we can do what we call a safety triage. In particular, if you're on the phone with someone, you'll want a safety triage, what we call their imminent risk, meaning are they going to attempt today? Um, if you're in person, it's something that you can wait and have a little bit more rapport with, but you'll want to triage on the phone because you can't see them. We learned this in listening to one of the calls. The agency that I work at is a 988 agency. We answered the suicide prevention lifeline. And I was monitoring a call, and our specialist handled it beautifully. Person called in crisis, thoughts of suicide. Um, they were de escalated. They felt very supported. They have a great safety plan in place. They're thanking our specialists for their time. Call was for like 45 minutes or an hour. And then the caller says, okay, I'm going to go put my gun away now. And we were like, oh, they had a gun in their hand the whole time and we didn't know it. So this was years and years ago. But we then developed our safety triage because we can't see someone to know in the beginning if we're working with imminent risk. That way, if they hang up on us, we know that we need to get 911 to them somehow. So that can be the same in your personal life. So when you're safety triaging is where you're looking for, is the emergency department necessary if I can't get to a safety plan or if I lose this person, like they hang up on me and don't want to talk anymore. So what you're looking for is, have they already attempted that day? If they've attempted that day, you probably want to take them to the emergency room just to get checked out. Or are they planning to attempt suicide? And if so, when and with what? And the when is the most important thing. A lot of people know what they will attempt suicide with. It's kind of a comfort coping skill, but they don't have plans to attempt, like definite plans of when they're going to attempt. So the when is the most important thing if you're looking at imminent risk. So you can ask that in like kind of layers. Like, I just want to check in with you. Have you had thoughts about attempting suicide? And if they say yes, would you feel comfortable telling me when you think you might attempt? And if they don't know, then you know you don't have imminent risk. You're good to go. You will eventually want to figure out what they are planning to attempt with, because even if there's not imminent risk, you'll want to put something in your safety plan, which I'll go through. But that's really what you're looking for is hospitalization going to be necessary if I can't change the direction of this? Is, are they going to attempt today or have they already attempted today? So any fancy risk assessment is essentially looking at these four components. And this is what you're just going to kind of be listening for in your conversation. Is one, suicide desire, which is the intensity of the thoughts of suicide that someone is having. And that's where we're doing our best to listen and to validate the underlying emotions going on to let them get that gunk out. You're listening for things like capability, which is how capable are they of attempting? Have they attempted before? do they know what they'll attempt with? Do they research their attempt? Because being capable for suicide attempts means that you have to have lost your fear of death and feel confident and competent in your attempt. And people do a lot of different things with that. A lot of people, again, survive their attempts and don't tell anybody. That increases capability. A lot of people research suicide attempts or they have a preoccupation with death, all kinds of different things. But for the purposes of kind of just like a conversation, and if I need to put a safety plan in place, you're mostly looking at, do they have coping adaptations that increase capability, like researching suicide attempts? So we can take that into consideration for a safety plan. And do they have a method in mind that they would use? Because we'll address that in the safety plan as well. Suicide intent is where we're looking at that imminent risk, and we're going to get that information directly no matter what. Do they have imminent risk? Because if I can't get to a safety plan, that means that we need to get to a hospital, meaning they're going to attempt suicide today with this. And then there are buffers against suicide. That's where we're listening, or maybe we know some things. So there are those things that they still are attached to life with. So you're going to be listening to someone's story so that you can get to a point to form the ambivalent statement. And you'll know when it's time to do that because you'll kind of know, like, okay, I know everything as it comes to safety. I've heard most of their story. It's probably starting to get repetitive. And you can kind of trust your gut. When you know it's time to move forward in the conversation, you'll use your ambivalent statement. So you're listening to someone's story, you're gathering your information, you've heard their desire, which is where you're utilizing those active listening skills to validate their emotions. I highly recommend looking up information on active listening. It's the cornerstone to any kind of helping relationship. It's not the way we normally speak, but it is very, very effective into being able to paraphrase what someone has told you and then connect it to an emotion word. I hear that you've had all this stress at home and you've lost your job and it sounds like you're feeling angry. I've paraphrased what you've said first and connected it to an emotion word. Capability is where you're listening for what information might need to go into my safety plan if that's necessary. If they're just having ideation and they don't have any plans to attempt, you don't really need a safety plan. Intent is their imminent risk. So I know if the hospital is necessary for if we can't get to a place of safety. And then buffers, their connection to life, remembering not the other way around. So when it's time to transition the conversation into safety planning or what are the next steps or the follow up or just I love you and I'm going to check in on you tomorrow, you'll want to make this ambivalent statement, which is saying, I've heard the stuff, the XYZ, whatever their examples are, and that's the part of you that wants to die. So I've heard that you've gotten in trouble at school that's causing some problems at home and you're feeling alone and that part of you wants to die. But I've also heard how much you love being on the soccer team and how much you love your dog, and that's the part of you that wants to live. So while there's a part of you that does want to die, there's also a part of you that does want to live. And you have to acknowledge both as someone being the person that's having this conversation. So let's say they haven't even given you anything. You don't know what their buffers are. You do have that they're talking to you. So you can say, I've heard that you feel like things are falling apart. You don't know where you're going to live. You're worried about tomorrow. And that's the part of you that wants to die. But you're here and you're talking to me. And I'm so glad that you are. And that's the part of you that wants to live. So while there's a part of you that wants to die, there is also a part of you that does want to live. And this is a statement because look, you're using what they've told you. So this is the truth. So you don't need to put it in the form of a question. And it's so important that that's why we listen. So we can put those paraphrase, the XYZs in there, because that's what gives someone buy-in. If you were just to say part of you wants to die and part of you wants to live, they'd be like, why are you saying that? But when you put in these paraphrasations of what you've been talking about, that's what helps someone to really see that it's there, even if they're only feeling the pain. So this is a great formula that you can always use. And then you can utilize that to transition into safety planning because most of the time someone's going to say, yeah, I guess. And you can use that. So remember that this conversation is not about reducing the pain or taking away the pain. It's about having a connection to cut that isolation. Because when you cut that isolation, that instinctual pain gets cut, and that person can choose to keep themselves alive, even though their brain might be telling them that they want to die. Listening and validation are your most important tools because that's what's going to form that connection to you, which is a connection to life, which cuts that isolation feeling. So, your conversation, your listening is the most important thing. Don't think that your goal is to make someone say, yes, I don't want to die anymore, because that's not going to happen. So, it's not to quote unquote make someone feel better, it's to make someone feel heard. Whoops, have this slide in here twice. So if someone, you create a beautiful ambivalent statement and they say, no, I don't see it that way, you can still use that to move on to safety planning if a safety plan is necessary. Or if not, like there's no risk factors for an attempt, you can just say, it's okay. I get that you feel that way right now. I'm still here for you. I love you. Can I call you tomorrow? That's fine. Or if you do want to make a safety plan, there are some risk factors in there you want to address. You can say, look, I get it. You want to die right now, and those feelings are very real and they're a part of you. But I care about you and I want to help. Let's figure out how to keep yourself safe just for today. And remember that safety planning is always for today. You've got to tiptoe when it comes to safety planning. It creates what we call psychological distance between yourself and this act of dying. And that psychological distance goes a long way towards reducing capability. So it's always just short term when we're talking safety. So you're going to try and put in good coping factors and protective factors. The amount of coping, like self-care versus safety, is going to depend on the individual and what's going on. But we want to remember that even things like having attachment to your suicide method or looking up things about suicide, that is a coping adaptation that is keeping someone's brain in balance. It's helping them balance that cortisol stress that's going on. And we don't remove coping mechanisms without replacing them with another one. So the focus of safety plans is not so much you're not going to do this, it's what are you going to do instead? Empowerment of what will you do instead of only just listing out what someone won't do. So addressing the desire is that we've been identifying those underlying emotions too, anger, fear, sadness. What type of self-care coping is going to help them through those emotions that they're feeling? Watching a movie, getting outside, taking a walk, walking their dog, taking a long shower, getting to bed, all those good coping mechanisms that we know. Let's try and put some healthy ones in place. And are they ready to talk to somebody else? That's a great step. And if they are, can y'all do it together? And again, always follow up. Can I call you tomorrow to check in on you? Capability is where we're looking at, what do I need to address to make sure that someone is not increasing their capability for an attempt? So avoidance of those capability increasers, like you're not going to look up suicide methods tonight. Also, if you're taking something off the table, what are we putting in place? So instead, you and I are going to watch the ball game type of thing. You also, if they do mention a method that they think about using, if they don't have imminent risk, but they're like, yeah, I think about using my gun or these pills or whatever. Ideally, you would love for them to give it to you or get rid of it, but most of the time that's not going to happen. But you can start with that. But then if they won't do that, you want to put in place what we call means restriction. And means restriction has been universally found to reduce suicide rates. Means restriction means that you're holding on to your method, your means, as we call it, but we're putting steps in place between your access to it. So, like if it was a gun, can you put a gun lock on it and I hold on to the key? If it was pills, can you go lock the pills in the trunk of your car and throw the keys into a messy closet? Can you go put the razor blades out in your outside shed? Or can you put them on a tall cabinet and move the step stool into another room? What you're doing is putting steps in place between someone and their method so that should that fight or flight kick on, they can't impulsively grab it and use it. And people don't flip flop on methods. Suicide methods are very, very intentional. So what happens when you put steps in between their method is what I want you to recall is what we talked about with fight or flight mode, how it clicks off the higher level thinking part of our brain when we have to think through steps on how to access something, it turns on the higher level thinking part of your brain. If you click on that part of the brain, it turns off fight or flight. You can only have one or the other operating at any time. So that means restriction, having to think through the problem to get to my method, turns off my fight or flight response and it gets the brain thinking. And that type of thinking with the forward thinking part of the brain makes it very hard to attempt suicide. So means restriction has really gone a long way towards reducing suicide rates. And then intent, a safety plan. There's very little efficacy to the kind of old school suicide contracts of I promise I won't attempt suicide. Remember, we're always thinking, what are you going to do? So working with someone with, okay, if you're feeling like you're going to attempt, what will you do? Is it that you're going to call me? Are you going to call 988, the suicide lifeline? Are you going to call 911? Are you going to get out of your house? Like, what are you going to do if these thoughts come up? Because it's okay if they do. We're going to put the plan in place for today. We can adjust the plan tomorrow if we need to. What are you going to do? So just keep that in mind with your plans. It's always what will you do, not what won't you do. And remember, always, always follow up. If it's not you following up the next day, who is? And it needs to be someone contacting them, not a promise that they're going to contact somebody else. And then there are resources you can use. Like you can dial 211. That's going to connect you to information and referral for health and human services. So, like if you were trying to find a mental health provider, or even if they needed help with stressors like utility assistance, rental assistance, legal assistance, you can dial 211 and get connected to a live resource specialist who can help you navigate that. Also, I do recommend for someone who does want to get in touch with a therapist, you can also go to psychologytoday.com. Psychologytoday.com has listings of all your local therapists, and then you can filter it by like what you've got going on that you want support for, what type of insurance do they take, do they do telehealth appointments? So, psychologytoday.com is a great resource for that as well. You can dial 988. That's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's available by dialing and by texting 988. You do not have to be having active thoughts of suicide to use 988. We will always ask, but you can say no. If that's so what you're ready to talk about. We are there for anything. Nothing's too big or too small to give 988 a call, but don't hesitate to call because you think you have to be in a crisis. That's why we don't really call it a crisis line anymore. We call it 988 because we want you to call no matter what. You need someone to talk to, call or text. And though it's a national line, it's a local service. Each states have their own 988 centers, and you will get routed to your local 988 center based upon the area code of the phone that you are dialing from. So you can look up who your 988 center is in your area and form a connection with them if you have more in-depth questions about how they operate. You can also text the word home to 741-741. That's a national crisis text line. And then there's also an app that I think is wonderful, especially for our younger people, called My3. That's sponsored by the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that's where you can put your safety plan in. It's called My3 because you'll put your three people in there that you know you can reach out to. It's got a direct line to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. You can put your safety plan in there, your coping mechanisms. It's a great app and it's free. And then for survivors of suicide loss or anybody who wants to get more involved with suicide advocacy or just in the community, you can visit AFSP, that's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, at their website, afsp.org. And they have a list of support services for survivors of suicide loss, like support groups or this program called Healing Conversations, which is where you can speak one on one with a lost survivor. And then they've got things like their Out of Darkness walks. They've got great stats and information on suicide and how you can get involved with that. AFSP is a wonderful organization that I do recommend as well. And then I just empower all of us to change the conversation, to empower individuals to believe that they can keep themselves alive even though they may want to die, which can only happen with letting them get the gunk out, not shying away from suicide, supporting others when they're experiencing suicide ideation, and to understand that this isn't something that needs to be cured, to normalize, destigmatize, and instill hope. And that is what I have for y'all this evening, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Oh my goodness, Sherrod, thank you so much for such a comprehensive um, talk this evening on suicide education. We really appreciate it. And I am giving you a virtual hug at this point. So
Thank
thank
you.
you so much. Did you take a drink of water, by the way? Did you, you know,
I
do any of
didn't.
that?
I did not, but you hear my voice starts cracking towards the end. So
Well, very good. Well, listen, we've entered into our question and answering period. So with that, Mr. Hamilton, Harold, would you mind reading the questions that were put in the chat for Sherrod?
Yeah, we have some that were put in the chat and some that came directly to me. So we have about 5 questions. So the first one we'll start with is says that some people can commit suicide in other unconventional ways, such as suicide by cop or by purposefully walking in front of a moving vehicle, etc. However, some people commit suicide by way of a prolonged method, like using drugs and or alcohol, in the hope that these are less painful ways of dying. Can you comment on those different ways and your thoughts about that?
sure, absolutely. Those type of methods, like you mentioned, that's a very good point. It's often, again, the way of somebody trying to, because it's so hard to take our own lives and inflict that pain, having some psychological distance that something else is going to be inflicting the death onto me, like jumping in front of a moving car or things like that. Suicide by cop is also a very real thing. It is why we're doing a lot with law enforcement communities on how to better kind of address crisis moments and suicide moments. Um, it's fairly common. There is a bit of a gray area when it comes to kind of like prolonged substance use and its correlation with suicide, where they're like, is this prolonged substance use kind of the painful, provocative experience that has someone feeling like I don't care if I live anymore, but not necessarily that it's their intent to make sure that that kills them. So it's difficult to understand because they can go so hand in hand, but it's actually not as common that somebody is under the influence of intoxication when they die by suicide. Um, Unless it was that purposeful overdose at the time. But it's a complex thought. But yes, definitely suicide methods can be by utilizing something else or someone else, and you can still address that. I had a client who their method of suicide was going to be driving to somewhere and then having something happen to them. I won't get into the details, but they would give their keys to their neighbor when they felt like they were going to attempt suicide. So we can address things, getting someone to give the real story of how they want to attempt or are desiring to attempt is the only way that then we can address it just like anything else. How can I limit your access to this attempt? There is a lot of impulse in the brain that will help someone kind of like get away from their attempt when it's not being done by their own hand. Like most notably, people who might go in front of trains or things like that, because at that last minute, they'll duck away from it or jump away from it. And sometimes it's not in time, unfortunately. But yes, that is definitely something that can happen, but it's all the same brain mechanisms.
Okay. The next question said, outside of the important proactive first steps of reducing stigmas around suicides, what can we, as friends and families, additionally do for those who have had the courage to express that they've had thoughts of suicide?
I think it's just something where you let people talk about it. And it kind of depends on your role with that person too. Because you don't want people to wallow. You want them to be able to also be taking steps to help themselves to feel better. That doesn't mean pushing someone into like treatment or therapy when they're not ready for it, but to always keep reminding them of the hope of saying, I'm checking in with you today. Let's talk about how you're feeling, letting them get that gunk out, and then reminding them, look, I'm here for you whenever you're ready to take that next step because I know you feel this way right now, but you don't have to feel this way forever. And that I can promise you. And so kind of finding that balance. But it's definitely important if you know that's what someone's struggling with to check in with them and check in with them directly. Hey, I know we talked about this last week. I'm just checking in with you. How are you feeling right now? Have you been having thoughts about suicide lately? And letting them know that you're an okay person to talk about that with.
Okay. Next question. Should you push a depressed person to get help, even if they don't want to?
I think again, it's a difficult balance because you don't want someone to be going to get help just because you told them to, because then they're usually not going to have a lot of buy-in in it. Now, it can be that inevitably they're like, "Oh, this is great," but ideally, we'd want someone going because they have realized they're ready for it. So I think acknowledging that you respect and understand how difficult that first step is really huge, and then even starting with like baby steps of like, okay, I get that you're not ready to see a therapist yet. Do you think maybe next time you're feeling really overwhelmed, you might just try calling the suicide line, or you might just try, going to the support group? Like a lot of baby steps are kind of necessary at times. So just working with them for what they feel comfortable with and not making it like a pressure. Like, I'm not going to be your friend anymore if you don't do this, but really being like, I think it could help and I want to support you in it. How can we start you on this journey? We can do baby
Should we
steps and
go
take your
with
time.
them? Should we offer to go with them?
I think that's a great idea, actually, if that's something they're comfortable with. Especially even being like, look, I can do most of the talking for you if you want, and you can just
Hmm.
correct me when I'm wrong. You can also call the suicide line together. I forgot to mention that. So, like, if someone's nervous about doing that, like, you could call and be like, hi, I'm Harold, and I've got my friend Sherrod here, and she's a little nervous, so I'm starting this phone call, and we can roll with it that way
Ah, that's
too.
good. Yeah. Okay. All right, the next one is an interesting one. So one misunderstanding that this individual had was the idea that we see so many more suicides now because we hear about it so much. Like the idea of it can spread like a virus. You're saying that's not quite how it works, but why are so many children's friends attempting suicide all the time?
So, the attempts are going up and the deaths are going up. It's that the ideation has always been there, but there are more suicide attempts and more suicide deaths. In particular, for our young people, it's quite interesting why that's happening. Our brains as humans have been evolving to where we can have a more constant release of cortisol to our brain. Cortisol is only really supposed to be released for about 20 minutes for fight or flight mode to get you out of that danger. But we can have now more than that 20 minutes, which is toxic stress to our brain. That toxic stress actually causes atrophy to a part of our brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which filters our reality to activate fight or flight. I'm getting somewhere with this, I promise. So when that atrophy occurs because of constant stress, that part of your brain will stop activating fight or flight or our crisis response based upon our sensors. You know, I see danger, I smell danger. It can instead activate fight or flight based upon past information or learned information. So that evolution of our brains combined with the evolution of technology, in particular 24-hour media and social media, means that
Yeah.
adults and our young people have constant access to learned trauma and learned
Mm.
danger. So when it seems like younger people are going into fight or flight and attempting suicide more often, they are, because the brains are literally different now. And with all this influx of learned trauma and even just the brain development at that age, they're more capable of going into fight or flight more often, which for someone who has thoughts of suicide would mean more suicide attempts as well.
Hmm. Okay, two more questions. This one is it says some people believe that if a person constantly tells someone they're going to end their life, that it can be an empty threat to get attention, especially with teens. How do we know when they're serious when they say those things?
What I always say is that if you think someone is talking about suicide to get attention, give them attention. That doesn't mean that, you know, if they say, I'm going to kill myself if you make me do these chores, that then they don't have to do their chores. It means you sit down and you say, look, I hear you saying these words that you want to kill yourself. I want to talk about what that means to you. What are you feeling when you're saying these words? And trying to have real conversations, because they'll get bored with that real quick if they're just kind of saying it. But it's pretty few and far between that someone is actually like threatening suicide when they're not having some sort of struggle beneath. It's actually even been shown that for younger people, suicide attempts can be kind of a cry for attention, not in a dramatic way, but it's because the brain understands that something is wrong, but we don't know how to articulate what that is. So that's how our bodies will react in that desperate cry, like something's going wrong in me. So I think it's really important that we discuss suicide in very real ways. And if someone keeps threatening it or bringing it up, that we're talking about it with real talk, saying, I'm going to take this seriously when you say this. I want you to talk to me about what this means to you. I want to talk about suicide with you. I'm going to keep checking in with you about your thoughts of suicide. Don't threaten the hospital. That's can be a very negative approach, because if they are having thoughts of suicide but they're not ready to talk about it, they're not going to talk about it anymore. If we're kind of
Yeah.
it doesn't help to kind of be punitive when it comes to
Okay.
addressing thoughts of suicide, but we do want to just, it's like, have the real talk about it. They'll get bored if you're not like
Yeah.
just giving them what they want.
Okay. And the last question, will this presentation be made available to this audience?
And the answer to that question is yes. We did record it, and we're
Okay.
going to post it to the 100 Black Men North Metro Atlanta's website very soon. And that website is northmetro100.org. Northmetro100.org. And we would encourage you guys to replay this as well as share it with those in your circle that may want to have this kind of information.
Okay. That was all the questions, Keith.
Okay, so we are at the end of the hour. Um, I'll open it up very quickly. If there is a burning question that someone has that they didn't get a chance to type in the chat, or if you have a comment of any kind, you can take yourself off of mute and share. And Sherrod, I'll tell you, I've been getting text messages throughout saying how wonderful this presentation is and that is really needed. So thank you so much for sharing and being with us this evening, and for weathering the storm in New Orleans right now.
Yes, which has died down. So, hey, we're good.
Very good. So listen, we will be in touch very soon. To our guests, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. And more to come from the 100 Black Men North Metro Atlanta chapter on this particular topic. So with that, we will say good night. And again, Sherrod, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.